When the Obama administration came into office, it was a particularly difficult time. There was a conflict going on in Gaza that the Israelis had entered into in an effort to end the bombardment of rockets by Hamas from the territory of Gaza. The Israelis were in the midst of elections, and it took some months to sort out who would actually be the prime minister and what kind of coalition the prime minister would have, and Prime Minister Netanyahu emerged from that process. So it was not until June of '09 that we really began to have serious conversations, although President Obama and I appointed former Senator Mitchell on the second day of the Obama administration to head up our efforts. He'd been, as some of you know, very successful in helping my husband and the Irish and British governments work toward the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland. So we were pleased when Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly declared his support for a two-state solution, something that he had not done previously. And we began working with him and with President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad. As you know, the Palestinian political situation became even more complex when Fatah and Hamas split, and Hamas essentially conducted a coup against the Palestinian Authority and took over Gaza, so that the Palestinian Authority is able to exercise jurisdiction at this time in the West Bank. So you already start with a division among the Palestinians, with the Palestinian Authority committed to a two-state solution, committed to the path of negotiations, with Hamas committed to violence and rejectionism. An intensely complex set of players and factors. But we have worked very hard to get the two sides, namely the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority, talking about final status issues. And the negotiations are proceeding in a context of difficulty because of demands that all settlement efforts cease. The United States supports that, believes that settlements are not legitimate, but recognizes the political reality in Israel that has to be dealt with. So I guess the bottom line for me is, if you wish to be someone who helps to guide and participate in negotiations, you must have a high threshold for disappointment, for setbacks, for the give and take, the to and fro of human interaction, and you have to stay very focused on finding whatever areas of potential common purpose you can. And we are very committed to this because we think it's in the interests of both the Israelis and the Palestinians, but more than that, we think it's in the interests of the larger region and indeed the world. So just a final word on negotiations in general. There's a lot of good information that has developed over the last quarter century about how to do negotiations, what works, what doesn't work, what kind of styles are sort of more common than others. But you just have to get comfortable doing what feels right for you, and you just need a lot of practice. You just have to, go out there and do it and try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. I did a lot of negotiating as a lawyer back in the days that I was a practicing lawyer, and then certainly as a senator in all kinds of political settings, and now as Secretary of State. And I'm delighted to hear that you know the importance of doing this, and we need a lot more people who are able to put aside their own preconceptions, their own prejudices, their own feelings, and work with parties who come with plenty of those, and give them the space and the encouragement to try to find some common ground. In today's world, that's a very, very important function to perform. Thank you.
Ngā mihi kia koutou. My name is Dr. Kim McGregor. I'm part of the Te Hakia Hine National Network Ending Sexual Violence Together. We were part of a government task force for action on sexual violence. I wanted to thank you for your address to the UN in September 2009, where you placed the sexual violence against women and girls as a core concern for security, and you commented that to solve this issue, women needed to be at the table. And I'd like to share an inspiring story from New Zealand where our community groups have come together and we have formed a two-caucus community national network, one representing Maori, one non-Maori, and we came to the government and we said we come in treaty relationship, and we formed a partnership with government, and we got a task force for action on sexual violence. I just wondered, in your travels as Secretary of State, whether you've come across a similar partnership between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and also in partnership with government, because this has been written about in papers at a conference as it being quite a unique outcome. Well,
first of all, thank you for focusing on this issue. Gender and sexual-based violence is a scourge that affects literally millions of women, and in some settings very acutely. It is increasingly used as a tool of war and conflict to not only exert power, but to break the spirit of families and communities. And it is a matter that I am very committed to speaking out about and looking for realistic answers to. I do not know of any other specific program like the one you're describing, which has in New Zealand Maori and non-Maori participants in partnership with your government, but I think it's an excellent idea, and I commend you and everyone associated with it. But part of our challenge is first and foremost to raise the visibility of this issue. I was just in Papua New Guinea before coming here, and I met with a lot of the women there, and they talked about the many issues that they are coping with, but violence against women was right at the top of the list. A high prevalence of such violence against girls and women undermines the productivity, the livelihoods, the parenting abilities, the community building efforts of not just slices of society, but society as a whole. So I'm raising this as I travel around the world, and I am pleased that the United Nations is finally focusing on this. They're focusing on it both on its own, but also in the context of conflicts. Probably the most horrific example of that in the world today being the Eastern Congo. I went to Goma, met with some of the survivors of these attacks by primarily Congolese army soldiers and militia members of the many different groups, all fighting each other in Eastern Congo. And I was pleased that just recently the United Nations Secretary General has made two excellent appointments, a long serving political leader from Scandinavia, Special Representative Wallström, and the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, who will become, or has become, the head of something called UN Women. So we're raising the visibility, and I think it starts close to home. It starts in our own communities where there can be zero tolerance for violence against women and girls, and where there has to be more education. I've worked in this area for probably 30 years, and when we first started, we really had to make the case that it was not just cultural, that there were not just some people, certain kinds of people for whom that sort of violence was just part of who they were and their traditions and their history. We made it very clear that violence against women was not cultural, it was criminal, and therefore we had to work with the police and the courts in the United States. One of the leaders on this is our Vice President Joe Biden. When he was a senator, was the principal sponsor of legislation called the Violence Against Women Act. So we've been at this in the United States. We have a lot more awareness now of the problem, a lot more programs to respond to it. We have hotlines and shelters, and so we have certainly worked at confronting it and eliminating it, and yet even, I have to say, in our own country, it remains a significant social problem. And then around the world, the more we can not only do what you're doing internally in New Zealand, but link up groups like yours and governments like yours, the more we can make progress together. So I'm hopeful that this issue will be right up there on the top of the agenda. And I just have to conclude by saying that I know that sometimes people say to me, well, isn't that, that's an important issue, but it's not like negotiating Middle East peace or ending other conflicts or taking on non-proliferation. And I just respectfully disagree. I think where you do not start with respect for the human rights of the people closest to you, you can unfortunately unleash behaviors that have repercussions throughout society. And where women and girls are not respected and accorded their full rights, then it's not far from there to societies like the one we are together trying to help in Afghanistan, where you go from it being just a little problem of somebody else till all of a sudden there are no girls going to school. There is a direct line between extremism and repression of women. In fact, my colleagues and I around the world often remark on the fact that most extremist groups, not confined to any one religion, but in fact extremists in every religion, always seem to end up trying to undermine the rights of women for reasons that escape me. I don't understand where that comes from, but it unfortunately is all too common. So, kudos to you, and I'll look to be kept informed about what you're doing.
Madam Secretary, my name is Rebecca Ford. I am a student at Ringiruru Girls' School. As a young person who is living in a world where we find it desirable and indeed necessary to balance toleration with national security, I'd like to hear how the United States defines the wrong hands that nuclear weapons could fall into.
I'm sorry, you'd like to hear me what? I couldn't understand the very end of what you said.
What is the United States' position on the wrong hands that you describe nuclear weapons may fall into?
That nuclear materials could fall into?
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent question. It is probably our single biggest fear in the United States government, that nuclear devices or nuclear materials can fall into the hands of terrorist groups or rogue regimes that would use them against either their own people or others. And I did a lot of work on this when I was a senator because the fact is we have overwhelming, credible evidence that Al-Qaeda has sought nuclear materials for years. And you understand why, because it is, if you're talking about terrorism, it is the ultimate terrifying prospect. But we are equally concerned about countries like North Korea, which engage in providing